original interface, and sort of that
like,
design
as
decision.
a user, why would I use that? Like if all of them updated dynamically as I change things, what, is there any benefit in my reordering them?
I mean,
So in something like Cedar,
yeah.
one of the GEO projects, scientists are used to selecting their data in particular orders. So they want to select their instrument first, the date time range, and then parameters. So if we can order it like that, it makes an easier transition. Or if you use it
So it's just comfort in visual display.
I mean,
usability.
Well, also for searching as well. So I want to first, just knock out things of one particular category, see what's around, and then fast down other categories as I go down this kind of search tree. And I don't want the things to be ordered in the way I search it, which is one of the primary use cases for faceted search.
That's what faceted searches do.
Right,
They don't
yeah.
need to be ordered
Yeah.
to do that.
The way you construct web services for S2S supports that. There's no reason that we can't use the IOGDS service to do a fully faceted search. It's just that I haven't got to the point where I've implemented it, so instead of just propagating down, it also propagates up, or it just basically constrains everything. I mean, there's a couple more interesting things, like you have to maintain the state of the search if you do that, which you don't have to do in a purely hierarchical search. So it was a design decision to basically get something out. Because basically, in a faceted style search, even when you select United States, even this facet gets updated. So it basically becomes that only United States is in there. So I would have to save the state of each parameter instead of just automatically updating everything. But you are right. And that's one of the future things on there. And actually, S2S 2.0 has a switch which can switch between faceted and hierarchical. The faceted part hasn't been implemented yet. So, I mean, that's basically just how, yeah.
That'll be ready for me when you use our places.
Probably not. Maybe. Definitely Bicodemo 1.0. So that's it for the default configuration. The last piece is all this metadata you've created has to get into some S2S somehow. S2S has to have some sort of access to it. Right now, we have this silly constraint that the metadata has to be loaded into a triple store. Actually, the triple store that S2S queries from. So that was just basically an early on design decision that we made so that we could get it up and running faster. I didn't know of really any good linked data crawlers at the time. But coming soon, there's actually linked data support, and I've been working with Josh on his, trying to use his Ripple software in order to be able to crawl that. And so that should be ready within the next month or so. But I'll talk more about that later. And then last step, now that you've created all this metadata, you've created your service, you've loaded the metadata, is deploy. And this one's actually really easy. So there's basically 3 ways that the S2S interfaces can be deployed. One way is as a standalone application, kind of like, I guess, the Orgpedia demo right now is in a standalone application. You can embed it in a CMS, such as Drupal, which is what we've done with IOGDS. Or you can embed it in some custom application, which is what we've done for Bicodemo. With that Bicodemo interface I showed you before, you saw the search panel on the left and on the right was their whole map service interface. So I'll talk about how you do each of those things. As a standalone application, it actually, I mean, you'll see it in a minute here, but it's really easy. S2S offers this core functionality where you just call init and provide the init function, the actual URI of the web service that you want to work with, such as example.com. And the rest sort of happens auto-magically, I guess, is the best way to put it. But really what happens under the scenes is in your HTML, in addition to calling this init function, you need to basically, using these ID attributes, you need to specify where you want the search panel to be rendered and where you want the results panel to be rendered. And so in addition to embedding it in divs, you can do it in a table so you have more control over the layout and things like that. In addition to having these specific things in the body, obviously you also have to have all of the scripts required for S2S. And actually right now there's a lot of different core scripts, and one of the things we're going to work on is having one dependency that loads all other dependencies so that you don't have to put 13 different scripts in in your website. Or minitize it or something so that I can just have one file that everybody uses. So embedding S2S in a CMS is just as easy as doing a standalone application. That's what we're doing with IOGDS. We basically copied the same exact code into a Drupal page and make sure that it loads the JavaScript in the right way. So one of the things you have to be wary of, and that we found with IOGDS, is that some CMSs have their own way of rendering pages and executing the JavaScript. So even though it does eventually throw the on-page init function or whatever, or the page load event, it would cause some browsers, particularly Internet Explorer, to crash because of some sort of conflict in how the JavaScript executed. So, I mean, like I said, it's simple, but there's some specific issues that you might have with the CMS, particularly if it has a lot of native JavaScript support. So the last type of deployment is S2S in an application, some application X. So this core init function that I was telling you about, it basically renders the interface in such a way that you put it in a layout, or you lay it out in your HTML page. But there's times when you may just need the search component and you want to feed the results to some other application, and that's what we've done with BicoDemo. So they have their own web service that actually loads an iframe to our search panel, but instead of sending the results to the typical S2S result, what we call the result panel, it pushes these results to the BicoDemo application so that it can update its interface. So I mean that's pretty much what I just said. It allows you to override what this results panel is. It could be a specific widget, or it could be some callback function for an application. And I'm not going to get into the details of this actual JavaScript, but we basically just write a callback that every time one of the facets is updated, it makes the appropriate query to the S2S service and pushes those results to the parent. And that's this particular function here, the map search results, and we send the data to them. That's it for service development and deployment. Does anybody have any questions on that before I get into the UI deployment or UI development part? Good. So this is actually one of the more fun things, and I worked on this mostly this afternoon. It's in IOGDS. There's a country facet, but in truth, so this is going to be a real world scenario for how the S2S UI development happened. The labels for a country are actually kind of a hack at this point. In the underlying IOGDS data, all we have is URIs to DBpedia countries. And so the way that those labels are generated from the URIs is we remove the namespace and then we remove the underscores. And it's really kind of an ugly way of generating labels. So one of the things that we can do in this real world example is to make the UI responsible for going off and getting those country labels. And then, while we're at it, just to show that we can do all kinds of crazy things with S2S widgets, why don't we add a flag thumbnail to the country?
There you go.
So if you guys remember, the country widget was one of those things. Obviously, every country has a flag. So the first step, kind of like the service, is that you need to create the metadata. There is a lot. The widget is the most intensive part on the metadata because there's a lot going on, or a lot that the S2S needs to understand in order to actually pull your UI piece from the web and render that. So you need to choose a URI. Don't worry about choosing the type. That's usually pretty straightforward. A lot of times I add a label and a comment to the widget. And if necessary, you might want to constrain your widget to a particular parameter. Now, you'll have a hardcore example of this in a second. In this case, because it's going to be a widget that renders a thumbnail and makes a request to DBpedia for country data, we're going to limit it to the logd country parameter. We also want to constrain the results. In this case, we're going to create a new URI that says very specifically, you should expect back an array of country URIs from DBpedia. So again, it would be better if I had the example along with these statements, but it'll be more clear in a second. So after this, after those things, you also need to list the function names that are required by the framework, specify the location of the JavaScript, and then if necessary, include the location of CSS files that you might need to render this UI piece. The caveat to the JavaScript is that you need to also include the libraries that you're using, except for jQuery. Don't include jQuery as a dependency because S2S at the core is based on jQuery. And so if you loaded a new copy of jQuery, it would override the $sign and nobody would be happy. And then also you don't necessarily need to do CSS because a lot of times you're going to be lazy and just embed the CSS directly in your JavaScript. So that is what the metadata looks like. It's probably not as complicated as I made it sound. Like I said, there's a label, a quick description. These are those two functions that I was telling you about. So I'll get into this for how you code these things. S2S requires two specific functions for each UI piece. One to generate the function, and the other to load that function, or load that widget with data. So the first step in rendering an interface is I build the skeleton of the frame, and I make the data request, and then I take the results of that data request and embed it into that frame. And now, of course, I also need the location of the JavaScript. So, what did I do? Oh, right. So, one of the other things was I said that some widgets work specifically for, I think I messed this up here. The metadata here is actually wrong, but I'll put a link on the S2S project page for what the real metadata looks like. In addition to having some constraint on what the query output is, it should also have a constraint on what the parameter is, like I said before. So this widget should only work for countries, and it should only work for this particular resource. The reason these aren't full URIs is because they all live in the same project with the namespace, but most of you know RDF XML. So I'd also defined this output format. And this is kind of going on Jim's question. It's a really ad hoc way of matching outputs or service outputs to UI pieces. Really, a lot of times what I end up doing is coining a whole new URI for every output type that I'm defining, even though some might be compatible with others. Really, the only way right now you can tell if they're compatible is by reading this human readable description and saying, oh look, I could use that output format instead of my own custom. So there's not much discoverability aspect to it yet, but that's definitely one of the things that we need to consider. I define a query, but that's not necessarily right. So that's all the metadata that you needed for the widget. The next step is to actually code it. So like I said before, there's two mandatory functions. One is the generator function, and the other is the callback. Be careful when you're choosing these names, these JavaScript function names, because what S2S does is it's attaching these to the window object. So if you use something very generic like a widget generator, and somebody else uses that, then you're going to clobber theirs because, So a good thing to do would be to try to do your own ad hoc namespacing. But since JavaScript doesn't take care of that namespace issue for you, that's usually not it's not as straightforward as a task. So I'll actually show you some of this code. The generator function here is pretty straightforward. Basically, what's in red is what's important here. All we're doing is creating some HTML object and returning it. That's it. So S2S takes care of the rest. S2S knows when to call this and where to save this object. So basically all I'm doing is creating a div and then another div inside that, and then just to let people know that there's not data ready, I usually throw in something like loading. So I build this HTML object and I return that to the framework. The next thing that I code is the callback. So this gets called once the data's ready. So S2S will take that div that you sent back to it in the generator and plug that into the interface. What it does with the callback is it basically sends that HTML piece back to you once the data's ready, along with the data. and then you can do the things that you need to do with it. In this case, we're developing this DBpedia countries widget. So what we're doing is we're getting back a list of country URIs. We're taking each of those country URIs, going off to DBpedia, querying it for a label and the thumbnail for it, and then including that back in the data. So this is where the DBpedia countries widget query comes in. So basically, I'll show you that function in a second. I mean, that's it. So I send the original data with the URIs to it. It makes the request to get the countries.json file. So for now it's hard-coded, but you can envision instead of using countries.json, you actually make the request to DBpedia. That was for performance. I think the query takes about 10 seconds right now, and I didn't want to slow it down for the demo. Right, and so then it makes that query, and then from the response it adds the label and flag to the original item. And then if we go back, we had this original callback, and then it puts it, let's see. Right, so I can do it with the mouse. This particular call here, widget.get, is what gets you the original div object that you returned here. So if I call widget.get, and then I ask for the data selector class, that was this entered div that the content part of the widget that I created. Let's see. So right, so that gets loaded into the div object, and then once I've downloaded all that data from DBpedia, basically, then I can attach, right, and so I actually covered some of it here, but I build this item that goes inside of the content. In this case, it's going to be a checkbox, which we'll see in a minute, and then I just append it to the div, and then the rest is taken care of. It's kind of like magic. But one of the important things that you need to know is that with these widgets, you also have to notify the framework when something gets updated. So when I make a selection in some HTML box, or when I check one of these checkboxes, basically this is what this whole click event function is for. So that will say, because you clicked one of the checkboxes, you have to update the widget now. And so that was this function here. And this is the most important API call, I guess, here. So basically, once that click happens, you update what's been clicked and what hasn't been clicked, push that back to the framework, and then basically call this global update that says, hey, this particular facet has been updated, everybody else has to go and update themselves now. Where am I here? Right. So that was it. That's how you build one of these things, and I can show you because that's fun. Right. Oh, there it is. So this is the outcome. So basically what happened was, the results that come back were the HTTP URIs, and then we built that JSON object from the Sparkle request and did the rest. And it's as simple as that. So this kind of shows you the dynamic nature and the configurable, the configurability of these widgets, sort of the open nature, all the different things you can do. It's whatever you can do with JavaScript. I usually say whatever you can do with JavaScript, you can do in a widget. So it's pretty open. Where was I? Right. Any questions on that? Because that's pretty much it for widget development. All right. So the last step is, again, registering this data and this metadata in the Sparkle endpoint. Any questions on UI development? Great.
We're going to have time to go through one?
Yeah.
Or let us go through one?
Yeah. This is it. This is the last slide. So this is the next generation of S2S. So all these things I've been saying about this coming soon, linked data, as opposed to having to register your metadata in a Sparkle endpoint. Thanks to Josh, I've used Ripple, and now what it does is instead of, basically it's a new, more deployable and configurable Java servlet, and has its own caching mechanism. So you can, instead of having to load this data in a Sparkle endpoint, you can just host your OWL file somewhere, and now it's basically a lot more open. There's less these single points of failure, I guess. The single point of failure being me, of course.
You mean for the configuration?
What do you mean for configuration?
So at one point, all of the S2S configuration is on queries.
Yeah.
Is there a point where that would become distributed?
That's the point of having this JavaScript. So now there's no dependency. Yeah, there's no dependency. Yeah. There's no dependency on the triple store in queries. It still does support having a triple store for performance reasons. So you can set up your own S2S metadata registry point, which is just a Sparkle endpoint, and configure that in the servlet init file. In the search interface 2.1, we're going to do more of these linked data widget things, kind of like what we saw today with the DBPDF flags and labels, and have a more modular means of embedding widgets in an interface. So right now, you can basically put your search panel someplace, and you can put the results panel someplace, but I want to be able to take it to the granularity that I can say, I want this widget, if it's a map, I want that to render in this location, or if it's, so basically I can scatter the widgets around instead of being in that up and down hierarchical organizable thing. So that's the whole point of that. And then sometime in the future, we're going to support more dynamic facet sets, which has been a request from not only Jin, but it would also support services that already have, like Apache Solar, that have these dynamic facets. But we could basically integrate the Apache Solar backend with the S2S front end, the widget capability, and stuff like that. So, but that's the reason that's 2x is because I'm not sure which one that's going to be. If you need. Yes.
Will we buy stock in the company?
There is no company.
Yes.
It's open source.
Open source doesn't mean
So you just
you
Red Hat
didn't
it.
make money.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
Sell the services, not the.
Well, you could be like Red Hat or you could be cool.
Feedback though, because I want to hear like everything I did wrong in this
did
talk.
you want, what were you asking for? Did you want to see some steps through some code? Is that what you were?
Yeah, I want to write it.
Yeah, so actually what I thought, I mean, I was like, did I just blink and miss something when you said this is what it looks like and this is what it's done? Because you did this all before, right? You built it.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't gonna.
So.
There's so much debugging involved at the time. Like, I said this took me an hour, but like it would have taken the whole time for me to just build one widget probably, and I didn't think that was a feasible thing if I wanted to just cover everything. So yeah, I pre-canned everything.
Right, okay. I thought for a second, did I just miss that?
Yeah.
But, so what you're saying is let's do some widget building. Right? In real time? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
So I would like to do that too.
Embedded in our website.
Where do we start? Let's just follow you through a little bit of it. I mean,
Okay.
just rebuild what you built pre-canned. Can we do that and follow along or something? Or?
Which part? Because I mean, I went through two basic parts. The third was the deployment part. But so there was one part that covered how you build a service, or what's required of a service, not how you build it, because that's
Right, yeah.
really up
Yeah,
to you.
so I think that's the key because, you know, one of the things we've had to iterate on in IOGDS is precisely that search service. You know, so we think, well, for example, adding language.
Right.
Okay, we know that one of the things that it requires. So we've added a language to the graph. We know it's out there now.
Right.
So now we want that to be a parameter.
Okay.
Okay. So.
Do you want me to walk through that?
Yeah, walk through that.
All right, great. So I can get a shell going here. Is that big enough?
Yeah, that's good.
So right now, because like I said, we're not supporting linked data yet, I host all of the RDF files that describe things. Actually, it would help if I brought up the slides again. So if we actually go the step-by-step thing that I went through earlier.
Because you make it look so easy.
Right, so the first step was identify your parameters. We've done that. The new parameter that we've identified is language. So that was easy. So we need to create the metadata for language. And right, so is language going to be a dynamic facet? So if I select a country, should that update what languages are available?
Yes, it should
Okay.
actually.
All right, so that's a dynamic.
Because we have Canada.
Right. Okay.
Do they speak
Canadian.
Canadian?
Well, they've got data in English and French.
And French.
Yeah. I don't know if they actually speak it, but.
That's
they do.
Canadian, isn't it?
Americans.
Yeah, that's Canadian.
That is Canadian.
So this
Most
just
of there's some Canadians.
this just happens to be where I'm hosting the RDF right now. But what I'll do is I'll open the existing log.g owl file that describes all the services and metadata and stuff like that. Right. So I mean, usually, like I said, what I usually do is just reuse some stuff that I had before.
That's all right.
Water sprinklers piping up and down.
Really?
Right. So we're creating a new parameter, basically a new service input called language. So that's what I'm going to call it, I guess.
I want to see that.
So I just changed the URI. So now we actually have a parameter called languages. We'll change the label of it so
What was,
that
sorry, what was that before? What did you do?
I copied and pasted an old parameter. This is how it goes usually.
The agency from?
Right. I made a duplicate and now I'm changing things. So this is really not that relevant. So I can just sort of delete it.
You could say country languages.
Search for data sets with a particular language. It doesn't, I mean, the comment really doesn't do anything at this point. It was originally intended that there would be a button that explained what that particular facet meant, because a lot of the complaints I got was like, okay, there's a countries facet here, but what am I constraining? Am I constraining the country that it was collected in? Am I constraining the country who's responsible for it? You know, things like that. So that was the original role of the comment. You said it's going to be a dynamic parameter. So if we go back to our slides here, we know that the second thing we have to do is create a query interface for each dynamic parameter. So if we go to so we can copy the query interface that was originally used for the agency's query. Right. We'll call it a languages query. That's just the easiest thing to do. Languages. This type piece basically says, don't worry about it. Usually, if you know what you're doing, you just copy and paste it. It has to do with the underlying ontology and how the innards of the framework works, but I didn't really want to get into that too much. I assume we're going to go with the same output format as always with all the other things, where we have this JSON array that has a label, ID, and count associated with it, so we can just stick with the same output format, and we're associating this languages query with the languages parameter. So now we have a new query interface and a new parameter. I think that's all we need. So this is the unfortunate nature of having a triple store. Every time I make a change, I have to reload, but that's only a problem temporarily. Okay, so now that we've done that, all of the actual, let's go back to our steps here. Step 4, I need to get Step 4 is create an interface with the results. The results aren't changing, so we don't need to do that step. Step 5, code your service. We actually have to go and do that.
You're not gonna touch.
No, I have a demo. So we'll go to Gemini. .tw.rpi.edu. Right, okay, so there's all the new demo stuff that I set up. I'm trying to think of the best place to do it.
Why don't you do those in core?
What?
Where's Jen?
So,
He knows exactly where to put it.
right. I'm gonna
Eric's doing your homework for you.
I'm gonna skip a step here. Sorry. Usually you would go out and code the service. You don't have to do that. First I'm going to describe it so that I know how to code the service. So I'm going to change the OpenSearch file. So basically from this I'm going to add a new URL that will request, let's see, demo.
We get an Emacs demo out of it.
Yeah, sorry, I'm an Emacs guy. Happens. Right. So we have a new URL that is responsible for making the language query. We named the parameter languages query, if you remember. What I will do is make the request language. But now, because we have a new parameter, we have to update all the other URLs. So this is one of the unfortunate things. So that finishes that one, but I basically need to add, what are we going to call it? Languages, I guess, equals, and this is where the parameter URI that we assigned it comes in. So I just add that to each of the
Do you have to add it to everything?
yeah, because I want every
Oh, that's what you
query
said
to
earlier,
be
yeah.
updated by.
Yeah, the reason he's doing that is because in addition to adding this this parameter languages, it's gonna show all the languages, and then he'll be able to click on. He wants to be able to click on French, and then see everything limited by just French.
Okay. So we'll also fix the default thing for now.
Okay,
We'll just put it at the bottom. So I can.
So earlier you mentioned having like different UIs for different level users. That would be through a different default interface through one of these, right?
Yeah, I haven't really. That's sort of an open problem right now, and I definitely forgot to touch on that at the end. Let's see if I have the example.
Don't lose your spot.
Oh yeah. That was kind of the idea behind this linked data widgets thing. So in addition to being able to, so if, say I have my underlying data, I think VSTO is a good use case. So VSTO is a virtual solar terrestrial observatory. It has both expert and non-expert users. But if I have a linked data vocabulary that describes the expert terms in a non-expert way, then I can basically replace one facet with the non-expert terms. And that would go out to the web and crawl all the linked data and pull that into your UI piece. That hasn't been implemented yet, and that's definitely one of those open things that still needs to be done for S2S. So there's a gigantic caterpillar right there.
got it?
Yeah. Okay, so we skipped step 5, which we will code afterwards. Step 6 is describe your service. Step 7 was create the metadata for your service. We don't need to change the metadata for the service because that's already been set up. Host the metadata has already been done because we refreshed the triple store. We were changing the default configuration file. We did not. Wait, did we?
No.
Yes, we did. Okay.
Cut it and double paste it.
Oh, you're right. We called it languages.
Yeah.
And we'll just use the regular faceted select, and it's enabled by default. So that pretty much covers it. So now everything is done except the service. So I guess theoretically, if we refresh this page, we should see another facet at the bottom that says languages on it. Cross your fingers. Yeah.
But this is being done to development here. Everything is development here. Except for the actual graph.
So what-
Right. So now we have the languages facet, which should not populate because
Right, because
we don't have a
built
service.
it.
We
You
haven't-
haven't, yeah. It's looking for, it's trying to call a particular query from
And this takes a
search.
really long time. Actually, that's surprising that this is able to get the response and go to DBpedia before the rest of these even finish. So that's nice. I lied. It's not going to DBpedia. I hard coded it.
Yeah, that's right.
I cheated. That's right. So languages will never populate. So the last thing we need to do is actually fix our service. So in order to do that, you have to be somewhat of a PHP person and definitely have a lot of familiarity with the existing service.
Yeah, but that should be, I mean, it's all those queries. In this particular one, you've got a whole set of queries which are almost identical. You're just looking for different. Do we know what the,
What did I miss? No, I want to know.
If it said the MIT license.
Oh, this isn't ours. This is a service that was created by Lee and Jin and myself and everybody else on LogD who's contributed to this service. So
you might need to pop out to the, well, you need to find the, where the searches are, but you might need to, so it's catalog underscore language. It's not languages. I don't think.
no,
I think it's
languages. Is it? Now we have to go to.
I got the whole freaking team here. Yeah, somebody can tell me.
We call it language.
Well, we said language is there, but don't you
Right.
need to, oh, that's,
Ugh. There's a lot going on here, I think. Facets. So we need to add a facet, it looks like. This is definitely the demo. Okay, so we're not breaking anything.
yeah, I saw you went into the 1.2 so,
Yeah.
directory.
That's the endpoint. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that would have to be done to change this service, I think. Oops.
So it's not using,
Right, so set sparkle, print debug, generate queries, that looks like it's important, no. Ah, here we go. So this is where we want to add another case in case anybody added a language. So this is kind of like not related to S2S. This is more the underlying things of how this happens, I guess. I mean, yeah.
If you go back to the original graph that showed the interaction of all the different services and show where what you're doing is on there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can do that. Now, this one or the more
This
complex
is the
one?
one I was thinking about.
Okay.
Will the other one be better?
No, this is fine. So you're playing the role. We are playing the role of the data manager at this point. We're basically adjusting this web service so that it can better search this data repository, which is the IOGDS data repository. We already set up the knowledge base piece, I guess, that had all that metadata stuff that we created. So all that is done. So the whole framework part is done. Now what we're doing is enabling the query to actually happen. If that makes any sense. Are you interested in seeing like sort of the flow of things, like I guess the call through the stack, or like how that actually happens? No. Is there anything else I can show? Because I don't know if there's going to be much value to me standing up here coding specific to IOGDS. I showed how you would extend your OpenSearch service, add the new metadata, and we have now in place this actual facet. We just need to fill it in.
Yeah, I mean, so there's the issue of that, but this kind of emphasizes how important that service is.
Right, yeah, I mean, the service is a huge piece. If we actually look at this, I'm going to have to comment that out because otherwise we're going to have problems. I'll just delete it.
This is the implementation of the actual service.
Right, so I mean, if we look, this is a 1100 line service that's actually taking the inputs, converting that into a Sparkle query, and then rendering it as an output. I think it's an overkill. Like, I've built much simpler services. I can show you one of those.
So pray tell. I mean, because it's bogusly slow. I mean,
Well, it's bogusly slow because it's now searching over hundreds of thousands, 700,000 data sets at this point.
okay.
So it's as fast as the underlying Virtuoso can handle, I guess, for the queries that you're required to do this.
But aren't we also hitting it multiple times? I mean, the way this is architected, aren't we?
Right, I mean, can you configure Virtuoso to leverage multiple cores and things like that?
We don't have a license for that, right?
Yeah, you can do that by default.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, by default, it shouldn't be that big of a deal that it's making 6 requests at the same time.
Okay.
But,
So with that being said, when we go to the STO and we're querying over millions of triples related to time, is that going to be a problem?
well, we've optimized the VSTO data model so that you don't have to query over billions of triples at the same time. We do some pre-processing on the data so that it actually performs.
Right, okay, cool.
But,
So what you're saying is with what we're trying to do with IOGDS is we've got kind of a tough scenario where we've got hundreds of thousands of data sets.
I don't know, I guess, does anybody have an opinion on how much work you would actually save by doing it all in serial or doing it all in one query? As opposed to...
I'm not sure what you mean.
So right now we're making 6 asynchronous requests. But what if we're 5 asynchronous requests at this point? But, so what would, I mean, how do you get this, say you could get all this data in one request. Wouldn't it take the same work? Are you going to run the same 5 queries and just not do them asynchronously? Or can you optimize somewhat, do you think?
So
Anybody have a guess?
Depends on the queries, but you're probably better off running them in parallel.
You don't think there's one conglomerate query that could get me all of the counts, all of the...
I'm sure you could construct one, but Virtuoso would, I mean, with the complexity of that query, would far outweigh the overhead, the extra overhead of running the other queries.
Right.
Plus, usability-wise, it's nice to see each box load, other than just sitting there waiting for like a big group.
yeah, and I think from a standpoint of maintaining the code, so yes, that service is big. What did you say, 1,100 lines? But we, meaning you and Jim, know exactly what to do to add another parameter.
Right. The way it was originally designed, I mean, Lee put a really nice framework together for basically, you don't have to write the Sparkle query. You just write the basic graph patterns that you need to add to the query. So, I mean, a lot of that code of that 1,100 lines is how do I take an array of BGPs and then a particular, header, footer, etc. for a query and piece all that together. Where the services I've written in the past are just sort of a simple, this function makes this query, this function makes that query, and so
it's the query builder nature of that service, which
right, yeah. It's a lot of the things that come for free, I guess. So it's a lot less overhead for us to add the language parameter than it would be for me to add to any other service that I built in the past. Did I confuse anybody? Do you have any darts to throw? Those are my favorite. That keeps me interested. Yeah.
So you're working on like a big new version of this.
Yeah.
And then kind of to you, I didn't mention this. Have you thought at all about the ability to maintain state in the URL?
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be a pretty straightforward. You just add a parameter to the URL that has some state object, I guess. So it says, you know, for this parameter, you know, this is the service that's running. These parameters you've chosen these values. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That would be done on the UI end as opposed to the back end that's coming out. But I should definitely add that. That would be something immediately useful.
And hopefully in browsers that support it, they would be updating that in real time as you click.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. What would you say? State full S2S? Is that what you? I mean, yeah. So, yeah, that is really a pain in the ass that you can't save your state. But sorry.
That'd be pretty cool because what that would allow is, I mean, it's redundant, but it allows you to come up in a particular state.
Right.
You know, for example, if Jim particularly likes it coming up in a certain way.
Yeah. And now, do you know how other like Ajax-based things? I mean, is the way that people usually solve that problem just not to use exclusively Ajax for everything, or how is that typically done? Should I have a?
You can set URL parameters, and you can actually set kind of what the current URL is, and manipulate the back button to the browser history.
Yeah.
To make them.
I know, but like, say the amount of state things that I need to capture is longer than most URL support. What's the typical way of handling something like that?
Then you put it in session.
Yeah. So I have to basically have some hash that will hash the state, and then you can just pass the hash around or something?
Yeah, store it server side and retrieve it when you get it.
Hopefully we don't have that problem.
Hopefully. Yeah, I don't think it should have that much information. There should be. But the problem is a lot of these things are URIs, so I'm using full URIs. There's no way of shortening that intelligently or in any useful way.
Question about the actual, so this is doing faceted browsing, but then when it's when you actually get this list, so you basically using this to window down a list of things. And I'm curious what the relationship is between, so these are all separate services.
Yes.
I assume they're all talking to the same
endpoint.
the same endpoint.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious why have all these separate services for something like this when you can kind of get a lot of these aggregations from, you can do a lot of this stuff with Sparkle just directly accessing the endpoint. Right. It would save you a lot of marshalling and unmarshalling time.
Right, so it would basically, I mean, one of the things that S2S is doing is it's serving as a proxy. And there's like 3 levels of indirection. So the first level of indirection is what the UI sends to the proxy, and then what the proxy sends to that OpenSearch service, and then what that OpenSearch service sends to the Sparkle endpoint. So it takes 3 levels of request. And the reason for doing that was because we wanted to we tied it to a web service implementation instead of tying it to Sparkle, I guess. Tying it to Sparkle would remove all that middle layer of indirection, but because we tied it to the web service, it doesn't have to be Sparkle. It could be an SQL endpoint, so the UI doesn't need to know how to construct. It wouldn't be useful for the UI to know how to construct a Sparkle query if your underlying data is in SQL, right? I mean, but if this knows how to talk to the S2S server, the S2S server can potentially learn how to talk to anything else. One of the things we were thinking about doing at one point was removing one of the levels of indirection, where instead of requiring the OpenSearch service, we adapt the S2S framework, the proxy in the middle, directly to work with with Sparkle. But you're still, in a sense, I think you're still going to be making separate requests. I mean, this is one of the things that Greg and I just said. Is it worthwhile to have one service that...
But these are all services that are going to be custom written to this purpose, right?
In a sense, yeah. I mean, we were also dealing with people who had legacy services, where, you know, they don't want to have to rewrite the work that they already did in those legacy services. When I originally created this, I only had one of the 3 browsers that I created working off of a Sparkle endpoint. One of the other ones was working off a custom written C database, which you could only use basically a command line API to access. And then the other one was a web service, an existing web service. So the nice thing about that existing web service
They're all
was,
querying the same entity.
no, they were all querying different apps.
So how do you do faceted browsing when you're not querying the same entity?
They weren't, but the use case covered those 3 different things. So the idea was that there would be the central portal you could go to and switch between data resources, and it's all the same look and feel to the interface. You know what I mean?
So, one of the anticipated projects or applications of this is a publications, Windows World Publications browser,
Right.
which I think everybody thinks would be totally cool. Can you sort of think out loud how you're going to attack that, or how that will be attacked? What's going to be needed for that, particularly in terms of the service?
So the service, typically what I do is I reuse one of my services that I've already done. So I could reuse what Lee's built, that whole query builder framework. That might be the best route to go. Because I'm more familiar with the services that I've built, I'd probably start with something like that. So basically I'd write this service that constructs the Sparkle query and then exposes the open search interface. After that, it's just the same old metadata that we did. But one of the things that Patrick and Evan and I had talked about at one point or another was that it wouldn't be this, it would be more like the S2S embedded in an application than S2S deployed as a standalone browser. So I wouldn't create a publications widget because if we actually go to, nope. Do you know what the paper is maybe?
What?
Right, so if we actually go to the page, this already knows how to render publications from Sparkle results, basically.
Right.
So what I would probably end up doing is I would write one of those custom things like we did. Let's see if I can bring up the slides here. Yeah, so where is it? Right here. So one of these custom callbacks where, you know, I make a specific request that says, based on all of your constraints, what are the remaining URIs for the publications? And then I pass those publications to something, or those URIs to something that would go off and build the Sparkle query, and then use Evan's RDF to HTML service to render that into HTML. So it'd be like an embedded thing. So it shouldn't be a terrific amount of work or a tremendous amount of work, but
It should be cool.
yeah, it should be cool.
All right.
Cool.
Any other questions?
Josh?
Will you put the slides online?
Huh?
Will you put the slides online?
Yeah, absolutely. Is it on the media site? TW/media? Or just...
Oh, no, just link to them.
Oh, the
from
TWeD,
TWeD,
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, what you can do is there's space in the kind of comment section, just link to whatever you want to link to.
Or send me a URL and I'll put it up.
Okay, yeah. I can definitely do that. Anything else? Last minute.
All right.
Sold.